played bishop f6, just saying, you know what, again, throw all caution to the wind, just attack, 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 attack. And this is actually very reminiscent of how, like, Daniel Naroditsky likes to play against. He plays sort of attacking ideas and just hope that it works.
I'm going to write him a message. That's very nice of him. I appreciate that very much. We're going to look at the first blitz game. Magnus is playing black here against Hikaru, who is white. Magnus is black. Hikaru is white. No, all GMs can play blindfold. I'm almost as good blindfold as I am in over the board. So Hikaru played the f4 line, which is definitely the most, how should I put it, the most topical line in the Alekhine. It's the attempt to refute it on the spot. But Magnus actually came very prepared against this line. And I don't want to delve too deeply into the opening theory here, which I don't even know myself. But I do know that when Magnus played, this line with bishop f5 and e6 is considered to be one of the main lines. And he develops this other bishop to its most active square. Now, obviously, the point is that at some point, he wants to take on c3 and damage white's pawn structure and then go after this pawn on c4. By taking on c3, black prevents white from potentially later on playing b3 to reinforce the pawn. So it wouldn't make much sense, for example, to go right after this pawn like this, because white would simply have b3. So that's why it's necessary here to give up the bishop. c5 undermines white's center. I'm pretty sure this is well within the bounds of theory. Now, d5 is very tempting, but of course you have to pay attention to the pin, and the pin eliminates a defender on the pawn, so black can even take it with the queen. Which means that Hikaru has to play a3. If he ignores this and castles, well, then Magnus takes, and then all of white's pawns become demolished. So Hikaru doesn't want to allow that. He plays a3. Magnus takes, Hikaru takes, and Magnus goes knight c6. Now, you might be puzzled by the fact that the c5 pawn is hanging, but, you know, these are what I call Irish pawns, or what they call them, the Charlotte Chess Center Irish pawns, also known as triple pawns. I don't even know where that comes from. But even if white can cling to these pawns, which he can't because they're forked, this is not a pawn structure that you want to get, even in return, well, in return for a measly pawn. So Hikaru very sensibly castles. Magnus castles, and here Carlsen plays a bishop e3, and a c captures a d4, a c captures a d4, and here we would like to pause the video. You can't alt-tal-tal. Bishop e3, knight a5, queen a4, captures. This does feel like a Nimzo Indian. In fact, this has shades of the Armageddon game, which I'll talk about later. Okay, so bishop e3 by Hikaru, reinforcing the d4 pawn, which makes perfect sense. And Magnus's move makes perfect sense as well. Knight a5, he's got to go after this pawn. That's his only idea. Hikaru defends it with knight to d2, lending reinforcements to the pawn. And Magnus drops the bishop back to g6. That's actually prophylaxis. This move might seem mysterious to a lot of people, but could somebody tell me what this is prophylaxis against? What is this prophylaxis against? Like, and what I mean by prophylaxis is he's preventing a threat that Hikaru has posed. What is that threat? And it's a positional threat. It's not a tactical threat. Well, queen h5 is illegal because of the bishop. g4 is not really a big threat because then you could drop the bishop back. Yeah, d5 is the unpleasant move. So if we just played h6 after d5, take a look at white's pawns and how strong they are. White wants to push them out to d6. And once he establishes a pawn on d6, well, that's going to be a splinter in black's side. Therefore, we play bishop g6 so that after d5 we could take, and the bishop does not lose its support. So, queen e1 by Hikaru, a very typical idea, potentially bringing the queen into the game, is his intention here with queen g3 or queen h4. Magnus goes knight a4, and here Magnus initiates a very interesting sequence of moves that I really, really liked. I was playing Title Tuesday while this game was ongoing, so I was keeping an eye on it with a corner of my eye. And now that I look at it with a fresh pair of eyes, I'm quite impressed with how Magnus handled this stage of the game. Not fearing Hikaru's attack on the king side, but rather going right after his weak pawns on the queen side. Knight a4 attacks the pawn on c3. And it's a very significant pawn because it's the base of the pawn chain. And when you eliminate the base of the pawn chain, that's not a pawn you want to sacrifice because the rest of the pawn chain essentially falls to bits. Which means that Hikaru has to defend it with knight f3. And now Magnus goes for knight b2, which is a very audacious move, and it looks more audacious than it is, in my view, because it's not like the knight's going to get trapped here. It's got a lot of escapes. It's got a4, it's got c4, it's got d3. And why is this move better than attacking it via knight b6? The reason it's better than playing back to b6 is because after knight d2, I believe Magnus had intended the move potentially bishop d3. And at the very least, it's an extra option, trading off the light-squared bishops. He can also, of course, repeat the position with knight a4, much as he would have been able to with knight b6. But this gives black a couple extra options, and sure enough, Hikaru tries to exploit it with bishop g5. Okay, he's attacking the queen. Magnus moves the queen up. And now Hikaru basically throws his chips into the center of the table by playing queen h4. It's very clear that he essentially is abandoning his queen side and banking all of his efforts on checkmating black on the king side. And he's going to try to make black pay for the absence of the dark squared bishop. Ideas like bishop f6 sacking the bishop come to mind. Ideas such as knight g5 afterward come to mind. And it's really obviously going to be a question of whether or not this campaign is going to pay off. So either this game is going to end in a black win or a white win. There seems to be no middle ground from this point on. And it makes perfect sense to me. So Magnus plays cd, and he takes on c4, well, which he has to. Hikaru repositions his queen on g4. And the idea of this move, I think, is twofold. First of all, he's paving the way for the pawn to run all the way to h5, which he attempts to do a couple moves later, which dislodges the bishop, which opens up the g file, which allows moves like bishop f6 to happen. And that dovetails into the second idea, which is that if you do sacrifice the bishop on f6, the queen is going to be well positioned to exploit the weakening of black's king via the g file. Magnus centralizes his queen. Hikaru brings his rook into the game with rook a to e1. Magnus brings his own rook into the game. You can very clearly see how both sides are essentially following their campaigns. Hikaru on the king side, Magnus on the queen side. And it's all moving inevitably towards some sort of tactical denouement, some sort of tactical climax in which the question is going to be whether or not black will be able to beat back white's sacrificial attack. And in general terms, that's exactly what happened. So h4 by Hikaru threatening h5. Now, it would be unthinkable to allow h5, so Magnus immediately nips that in the bud. Of course, this creates a weakness, and this also weakens the bishop on g6. And Magnus, and this is what makes Magnus Magnus. You can't outball Paul. This is what makes Magnus Magnus. You know, once Magnus decides on a certain course of action, he doesn't look back and he doesn't flinch. And he collects the pawn on a3 here because he's determined that either white's attack is going to work or it's not, and there's going to be no middle ground. And as International Master Nikolai Minov used to say, at least I'm going to die with a full stomach. So what Magnus is doing is that if this attack fails, he's ensuring that he's going to be completely winning. Because now he's already up 2 pawns and he's got connected passers. So he's, one could say, bracing for impact by collecting as much loot as possible in preparation for white's attack not succeeding. I don't know if that makes sense. But there's very little he can do here in terms of bringing defenders onto the king side. Like, his king side is as it is. The queen can't come back. The bishop on g5 is slicing through black's position, not allowing... The knights are already on the queen side. It's too late to try to bring them over to the king side. The Russian expression, having said A, you also have to say B, comes to mind here. Like, he's already started what he started. He might as well die with a full stomach. And sure enough, Hikaru plays bishop f6, which, if I've explained this well, should not surprise anybody. He's trying to rip open black's king side. Param asks, in a blitz game like this, how far do you think Hikaru calculates his attack? I would say that you would be surprised to find that neither side is really calculating far at all. Why is that? Because in a situation like this, there are so many candidate moves to consider that in a blitz game, they're largely relying on their intuition. What do I mean by an abundance of candidate moves? Well, first of all, you have to consider GF, and certainly Hikaru attempted to calculate this move. And I think Hikaru concluded that after e takes f6, he has such an abundance of tactical resources that this doesn't require any deeper calculation. Now, you might be saying, well, how the hell does Hikaru get away with this when you might try to do the same thing and then the attack crashes and burns? Dikayo, good to see you back, man. Does that mean Bullet is all intuition? Pleasure to see Dikayo back in the chat. Bullet is 95% intuition with one exception. And that exception is in Bullet games, and if you watch my own Bullet games, you will notice this. I sometimes take 1 or 2 moments. I define them as critical moments, and I take 10 seconds or so and actually calculate and determine my proper course of action. Okay? A lot of people assume, and this is their downfall, that in Bullet you have to make every move instantly, but if you actually study the Legends Bullet games, Hikaru, people who have been good at Bullet for a long time, you will actually see, and I've done this, that they sometimes take 1 or 2 moments in a game and actually take 5-7 seconds to perform some very basic calculations. Okay? So I want to make this point very clear. Now the move Bishop f6, I can bet you Hikaru played very quickly, because it's the sort of situation he's already bitten off more than he can chew. He either does this or, he might as well die. It's the same mentality Magnus is having, just on the other side. If he doesn't do this, he's going to be down 2 pawns for no compensation. So how do you identify these critical moments? This would be a situation where even in a Bullet game as black, I would spend 10 seconds evaluating whether or not I can take on f6. Because if you've determined that you, in fact, can take on f6, this is a moment where you can potentially refute the attack. Let's try to unpack this for a second. I, again, repeat to you guys, I haven't consulted this position with a computer, so probably everything that I tell you will be wrong, but in my opinion, the fun of game analysis is precisely, to try to arrive at the truth yourself and to discover so let's discover some beautiful lines here. What do you guys say? So let's try to understand what White's threats are in this position. Obviously, there's the potential of a lobster pincer checkmate. Queen f6, queen h6, pawn on f6. Unfortunately, while watching the clip, I did catch the computer's evaluation. My eyes could not be averted from it. And the computer says, I think black is winning after rook c3. Now let's try to figure out why that's the case. Queen f4 is the move that needs to be refuted. And I think I see actually the refutation of this move. Would you guys like to take a stab at trying to find how black prevents the idea of queen h6? Typing video has, I have one of my YouTube videos has a clip where I'm typing. Now king h7 is very tempting, but it allows knight g5 check, and at the very least, white can repeat moves here with knight f3. So king h7 cures the symptoms but not the underlying cause. When you're trying to defend, try to cure first and foremost the underlying cause, which is the pawn on f6. It's not queen h6, it's the pawn on f6 that you need to be looking at here in order to attempt to root out the cause of the attack. And some of you guys are actually saying the right move, queen f5. Putting the queen in front of the queen on f4, and after queen h6, there's queen takes f6. And look at this bishop on g6, the unsung hero of the defense. The queen then returns to g7. And of course, white's attack, completely save for some hope chess ideas, fizzles out. So I believe the move queen f5 ends the game immediately. So that's an important thing. Trying to tackle the symptoms rather than the cause is a very common mistake that people make when they're defending, because they see the immediate threat of queen h6 and they try to stop that one rather than understanding why queen h6 is strong. Queen h6 is not strong because there's a queen on h6. Queen h6 is strong because there's a pawn on f6. Sorry to belabor the point to such an extent. What was the rook move for? I think it was to immobilize the knight. So if you made any old move here, such as b5, my guess is that white has a very unpleasant move, knight e5. What does knight e5 achieve? It achieves three things that I see immediately. Number one, you guys now see that the window of opportunity has closed because the rook is defending f6, which means that this is now a much stronger threat. Number two, it does attack the knight, which will we actually go ahead and take the knight? Maybe not, but we don't want to just give up free knights. And third of all, knight takes g6 is a very, very nasty threat because you simply penetrate through another avenue here. F takes g6 is checkmate, and white is threatening a devastating discovery. Holy smokes, Yazazazzy. He is Zazzy gifting 2 subs to Lord Skubar and Ivanovich 271. Thank you so much, man. Appreciate it. Need some water. Jesus. So hopefully that makes sense. Now, queen takes d4 check is not a scary check because the king actually becomes very, very safe on h1. This doesn't actually do that much for black. So hopefully that makes sense. Now, that's the thing with computer moves. In retrospect, this makes perfect sense. But it's difficult to, like, understand that, if that makes sense. During the game, in the heat of the moment, this looks very scary. This looks very scary. And for that reason, Magnus refrained from taking on f6. Now, what I said in the beginning about Magnus not playing well, this is exactly what I mean. For an idiot like me, not taking on f6 is totally normal. For Magnus, refraining from taking on f6 speaks to, in my opinion, a fundamental lack of confidence and belief in his defensive abilities, which has always been the mainstay, the cornerstone of one of the things that makes him so great is his ability to call his opponent's bluff, and calculate seamlessly in the span of only a couple of seconds. So Magnus still won this game, and he goes knight c2. But he allows Hikaru the opportunity to complicate things with bishop d3. Very, very strong move, in my opinion. Of course, a distraction sacrifice, so you cannot take the bishop because of checkmate. Now the window of opportunity for taking the f6 bishop is closed as well. Thank you, Bangtown, California, for the sub. Yeah, I understand your question, Prem. I think it was a little bit of both. I think the game that Hikaru had to win with black, Hikaru deserves tremendous credit for that game because of the fact that he played the King's Indian and won with black. Winning with black against Magnus, as I said, is a Herculean effort. So that window of opportunity is closed. Now, Magnus does take on e1, and I think the critical position arose, perhaps in this situation. Magnus drops his queen back. What is the purpose of this move? The purpose of this move, I think, is that after bishop takes, pawn takes, queen takes, black is preemptively defending the pawn on g7. And he can now bring his queen over to f7 in a familiar defensive maneuver and lend some reinforcements to the king's side. Typical Magnus move. Now, I think that perhaps Hikaru should have done something like this and maybe dropped his queen back to g3 and prepared knight g5. I don't think any of this works. I'm not sure exactly. I heard from someone that Hikaru did have a draw somewhere, but I'm not sure exactly where it is. And I think for a human to find that draw is almost impossible. Now, Magnus does play rook c3. Hikaru tries to muddy things up with d5. What is the idea? The idea is that he takes d5, meets with what move? Why don't you guys take a stab at finding the idea here? What is the idea? And this is a very typical positional idea, actually, not just a tactical idea. It manifests itself in a variety of different positions. It's a very classic pawn break through e6, opening up the e5 score for the knight. And in this position, you guys can already see that there's a million pieces involved in the attack. Queen takes g6 is coming in. And there's huge trouble here for black. So for that reason, he, of course, refrained from taking on d5. And instead, he drops his rook onto c3, pinning both the bishop and the knight. Okay, so rook e3 by Hikaru attempting to solve the question of the pin and free up the knight. Takes, he takes d5. This stream is like Agad but live. Well, that's the point. I'm trying to provide analysis that will be both entertaining to high-level players and accessible to lower-rated players. I hope I'm succeeding. I know I make errors. I learn how to do it better. Now Hikaru, and notice what Magnus is doing here. And I want to point out that this is a very important defensive mechanism that everybody in this room should take to heart, okay? when you're up a lot of material, remember that you can give some of it back in order to prevent some of the threats. Don't be greedy. Remember, after rook d3, ed, what has Magnus accomplished? Magnus has eliminated one of white's strongest attacking pieces, the one that would have allowed Hikaru to take on g6 and at least make some inroads. So now this bishop on g6 is both uncontested and solid as a rock. Appreciate it, you guys. Very, very sweet. And thank you for all the support so far. You guys are awesome. Really. And I'll talk more about that later. But what happens here? Magnus is up 3 pawns. And the bishop on g6 is solid as a rock. There's no more attack. Hikaru tries to open up the e5 square. Now he's 4 pawns down, and the rest is a matter of mopping up. The attack is over. Hikaru, is extremely resilient, and it's not that he should have resigned here. He tried everything he could have tried, but down 4 pawns with no attack. We won't look at the rest of the game. I'll just very quickly play through it. Magnus finds a very nice simplifying mechanism to force the trade of rooks. Again, he uses the same technique here. He doesn't even give up any of his pawns. Bishop takes f6. Now, we got a queen endgame. Remember, even queen endgames down 4 or 5 pawns can be drawn. I think I showed Charlie once a game that I played against a 1900 where I drew, I shit you not, queen against queen and 4 pawns, and 3 of them were connected. So it's always possible to fall into some perpetual, but Magnus plays it very expertly, centralizing his queen, stopping queen g6. And now he, again, gives up a bunch of his pawns, but he pushes the most far advanced one. And now he escapes the checks easily. King comes to h4, very nice little square. And queen e5 check. Boom, 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 boom. Now, even at the very end, I guess he could have promoted as well. But he plays this as accurately as possible, forcing the king onto the first rank in order to promote with check. So this is how Magnus won his game. And I think where was Hikaru's specific mistake? I'm not actually sure. I think Hikaru, someone pointed out that perhaps he should have gone earlier toward the queen side. Toward the king side. Maybe queen e1 immediately. Maybe sacking on c4 and going bishop g5, queen g3 made a little bit more sense. But, of course, hindsight is 20/20. And it's very difficult to sense the moments when you should throw all caution to the wind. And, you don't know how much you should defend, how much you should attack.